Good morning. Good morning to those of you who are here. I know there are other folks out in the lobby who will be making their way in shortly. I want to thank the Young Center staff, Elizabethtown College staff, our volunteers, and others who have been so helpful to me in organizing and coordinating this conference the last 3 days. Thanks to all of you for being here, the content you provided, the questions that you asked, your presence, the connections. Obviously, we couldn't have had this conference without you. And so thank all of you for being here, for your participation. I learned a lot in every session that I went to. I learned something, and I would have learned things in the sessions that unfortunately I couldn't get to. I think I said this in the session that I convened. My only regret was that I couldn't go to more sessions, and someone told me that was my fault because I came up with the schedule. And I should have planned it differently if I had wanted to attend more events. But I have friends who say, Steve, you've been doing things with Plain Communities for a long time. Do you learn anything new when you go to these conferences? And I say, absolutely. Every time, every session, because of the new insights and experiences and information and relationships, again, that you all bring to these events. So thank you very much for being here. And again, I want to thank Kay Wolf, Cynthia Nault, Edsel Burge, our volunteers, Samantha Brandt, and the folks from Elizabethtown College Catering who provided our food, and other folks from facilities and environmental services who keep our campus looking nice and as a great place for us to work and for you to visit. So I want to, again, thank all of them who helped make this event possible. Before you leave, if you would take your name badge and leave it in the box that is marked that way on the box marked for badges on the registration table, we will reuse them in the future. If you are staying on campus in Hackman Apartment or Brinzer Dorm and haven't yet given your key, both the swipe card and the metal key, you can return those also at the registration desk before you leave. There will be someone there until 1 p.m. to receive your keys, so if you don't have it with you now, have to go back and get something, you can come back here to Loeffler Lobby up until 1 p.m. to turn in your key. The bookstore area will be open for a short time after this session is over until 12:30 today. So if there's still additional books you'd like to buy, you can go to McCormick Gallery to make some book purchases until 12:30. Also, all participants will receive a survey. It'll be an electronic survey for most of you, members of the Plain community who registered without an email address. We will get you a paper copy of the survey about your experience with the conference, your evaluation, and your suggestions. This morning, we turn in our final plenary session to exploring yet another example of the varied interactions between the Amish and their neighbors, in this case as actors in the American civic landscape. In recent years, political operatives have engaged in formal and informal efforts to register Amish voters and mobilize them on Election Day. In particular, several presidential elections witnessed significant outreach efforts to members of Old Order communities in Pennsylvania and beyond, as we'll hear. And to what extent, the question is often asked, to what extent did the Amish respond or participate in these elections? And to look at that question, we'll be hearing from Dr. Kyle Kopko, who is an adjunct professor of political science here at Elizabethtown College, and also the executive director of the Center for Rural Pennsylvania, a legislative service agency of the Pennsylvania General Assembly based nearby in Harrisburg. Prior to that full-time job, Dr. Kopko was associate professor of political science here and also associate dean. He holds a PhD in political science from The Ohio State University. He's the author of more than 30 scholarly publications, including a couple books I'll mention one, Do Running Mates Matter? The Influence of Vice Presidential Candidates in Presidential Elections, from the University of Kansas Press in 2020. And his research has been featured in national and international news outlets, including BBC, CNN, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and many others. So let's welcome Dr. Kopko as he shares Plain Politics, Assessing Old Order Amish Voter Participation in the 2004, 2016, and 2020 presidential elections. Welcome, Dr. Kopko.
Good morning, friends. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here this morning. And before I get started, I do have to offer this disclaimer since I am an employee of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So everything I'm about to say here is in my capacity as an adjunct professor of political science here at Elizabethtown College. It does not reflect the views of the Pennsylvania General Assembly. And most importantly, no taxpayer resources were used to create this presentation. And speaking of resources, this has been an ongoing project for many, many years, and so many folks are to thank for this. But first and foremost, the Young Center, obviously, through their generosity, their funding, we were able to work on data collection methods over many, many years. And most recently, we had a team of student researchers, and I wanted to personally name and thank them for their hard work and dedication. Andrew Furman, Madison Miser, Ali Melnikoff, Ashley Rank, and Destiny Troy. Obviously, Steve Nolt has been instrumental, Don Crable has been instrumental, Conrad Knegi, and so many others. So this is just not me. This is really a team effort. And to that end, I thought I'd start off just with a bit of a personal note and explain how this all started. Some of you may know that I was a student here at Elizabethtown College some years ago. In fact, I credit the start of my academic career starting some 17 years ago in the Young Center. It was my very last semester on campus before graduation. And I took a class called Amish, Mennonites, Brethren, and Hutterites, taught by Don Crable. And this was after the 2004 presidential election. I was a political science major, had been politically active, and I knew about efforts to register members of the Amish community in Lancaster County. And like any good seminar, we had to write a class paper. So I talked with Don and said, hey, I have an idea. I have this information about what had happened in Lancaster County. What do you think? And he encouraged me to pursue that paper. It led to a number of qualitative interviews, data analysis. I'll be honest, it was a lot of work. Don only gave me a B+. He's a tough grader, but I kid Don because he's been such a great mentor and friend to me, and I'm sure that's true of many, many people that are here today. But to show that this has been truly an ongoing project for many years, and I'm sure more will come in the not too distant future. So with that, I'll provide an overview of what I'm hoping to do here today. First, I want to just provide a brief background on civic participation and political involvement among the Amish, nothing too detailed. Also provide an overview of some of the recruitment efforts that had occurred in recent presidential elections. We'll get into the empirical results of the data analysis, and I'll offer some thoughts on the implications of these findings too. At the very end, there's also going to be time for question and answers and also comments. There's 2 microphones at either end of the stage here, just like the other plenary sessions. So if you have a question, please come up to one of the microphones. Or if you don't have a question, but you have an observation or a comment, we have a lot of different individuals from across the country here. So if you've experienced something in terms of outreach to any members of the Plain community you think it would be worth noting here, please feel free to share that as well. And we'll start here by talking about the two-kingdom theology. And many of you are familiar with this, and the idea of having a separation between church and state within the Anabaptist faith. Much of this stems from a number of Bible verses, but I think that 2 are really worth pointing out here. John 18:36 and Matthew 22:22. So My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were from this world, would my followers be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews? But as it is, my kingdom is not from here. Again, emphasizing that there is a distinction between the godly realm, what good church members should be doing, and what Caesar's doing. In Matthew 22, give therefore to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's, or render unto Caesar for other translations of the Bible. This has emphasized a philosophy where Anabaptists and plain groups should honor and obey governments, they should pay their taxes. But again, there's this distinction between being part of the secular world and the holy kingdom of God. So that has in many ways influenced Anabaptist behavior towards political involvement, particularly voting, for many, many generations. And as a political scientist, I'm not a theologian, I'm not an expert in Anabaptist groups, but I tend to look at these questions from a social psychology, political psychology viewpoint. And a lot of this comes down to a theory called social identity theory. So how do we think about ourselves? What's our self-conception? So if we fully embrace this Anabaptist theology, this two-kingdom theology, that should have implications for human behavior. And in some of my other research, aside from Old Order communities, I've found empirical evidence for this to be the case too. I'll give a very brief example in an analysis of members of the Mennonite Church USA. Those who had stronger Mennonite identity, had stronger Anabaptist identity, were less likely to be engaged in political activity, particularly voting. So that should also influence in some ways this worldview on how one should engage with political actors, with voting, members of government, so on and so forth. Now, that's not to say that the Amish are disconnected. That's very much not the case. Now, historically, it's been true that members of the Plain community have been involved in local affairs, particularly in township, municipal matters. Tip O'Neill's famous saying, all politics is local. That's where folks are going to have the greatest impact on day-to-day operations, things like zoning issues, what you can do with your property. There have been anecdotes of some members of the Amish community historically maybe serving on a supervisory board or something like that. Nothing quite in recent times, but historically there is that type of precedence. And Amish members are very clearly part of our local community. I think a wonderful example is volunteering with local fire departments. That's a form of civic engagement. They'll help with disaster relief efforts. These are all things that they do on a regular basis that we're all familiar with, where they are contributing, they are interacting with members of the community, they are being civically engaged. Maybe not politically engaged, maybe not in terms of voting or things of that nature, but there is that tradition. At least among some members of the community, though, there has been a steady stream of voters among some settlements, among some districts, but it is a minority viewpoint. And by some of our estimates, through the 1990s, maybe a few hundred Amish individuals registered to vote within central Pennsylvania, primarily the Lancaster settlement. We started to see a shift in outreach to Amish voters, or potential Amish voters, I should say, during the 2004 presidential election. So some of you may remember the political climate back in 2004. For those of you who don't, let me have a brief refresher here. We had a disaster of an election in 2000. There are a lot of election snafus in the state of Florida. Officially, the Florida count was decided by 537 votes, and that was the decisive state in the Electoral College. And because of that state's outcome for President Bush, he won in 2000, went all the way to the United States Supreme Court, controversial decision in Bush v. Gore. At the time of 2004, that competitiveness from 2000 was still on the minds of many political operatives, not just in Pennsylvania, but throughout the entire country. Combine that with a number of social issues that were bubbling to the top, especially same-sex marriage, concerns over abortion. That helped to energize a lot of conservative organizations to try to find new groups of individuals who could serve as voters and support the Bush-Cheney ticket. And Pennsylvania was still viewed as a swing state in 2004. Even though it really hadn't voted Republican in several presidential elections, it was still viewed as being in play during that time. In Lancaster County, in particular, we saw an interesting phenomenon because there's a gentleman by the name of Chet Byler who was serving as the chairman of the Republican Committee of Lancaster County. Some of you may recognize that name. He ran for Congress numerous times against Lloyd Smucker in recent years, our current congressman. And Mr. Byler also was born Amish. And he had grown up in the community. He was never baptized into the church, but his extended family members still had good relations with him. He spoke Pennsylvania Dutch and was able to personally make inroads with the community, this grassroots one-on-one outreach effort. So that was a factor, too, in outreach in 2004. But also, there was a candidate, I think, in many ways that was sympathetic to the Amish community. President Bush is someone who was open about his religious beliefs. He openly talked about the value of his evangelical faith. He had this rural persona, as you can see from this picture here from the George W. Bush Presidential Library. At least publicly, the image that the Bush administration liked to project was when he had downtime, he'd like to go back to the ranch in Crawford, Texas, and clear brush. So having that type of plain, simple, rural persona, open about the importance of religion and faith, I think all those factors confluence together in the 2004 presidential election. And there was some intentionality, too, on the part of the Bush campaign and other political operatives, particularly with regard to their focus on Pennsylvania. I think there was a real concern that 2000 could repeat itself. And Pennsylvania potentially could have been the Florida of the 2004 presidential election. So just to put this in context here, after Texas, President Bush visited Pennsylvania more than any other state since taking office. Those weren't always campaign visits. Sometimes they were official White House visits to tout some sort of policy matter. But he visited Pennsylvania 44 times since taking the presidential oath of office. Again, second only to Texas. Now, of those visits, 11 were to either Lancaster County or one of the surrounding counties. And he had 2 campaign visits to Lancaster County specifically in the fall of 2004. The first one was at Lapp Electric in the eastern part of the county on July 9, 2004. And there's actually a photo here of President Bush meeting with individuals at Lapp Electric for a campaign stop. And later, there was a visit to the Lancaster Airport in Lititz on October 27th. I'll talk about that in just a moment. In addition, Vice President Cheney visited Pennsylvania 19 times since taking office. So again, there's a strong emphasis here, a strong desire to carry Pennsylvania within the Electoral College because it could be decisive. Now, during the trip to Lapp Electric on July 9th, as the story goes, the presidential motorcade was driving along and President Bush saw some Amish working in the field not far from Lapp Electric, and he asked the Secret Service to pull over, make arrangements to meet with them, and so they did. They had a quiet meeting, secluded away from reporters, and it was an opportunity for President Bush to actually meet with members of the Amish community for the first time in Lancaster County here during this campaign visit. And at this time, members of the Amish community gave him one of their straw hats that they had been wearing. They were talking about religious faith, farming, and basically they had a positive interaction during that meeting. And as one Amish member who was there in attendance and observer noted, it spread like wildfire, anecdotes about this encounter. There was a bush fever, as they put it, among the community after this visit. And actually, that was the impetus for the title that Don and I wrote in 2007, Bush Fever, that first documented voting patterns in Lancaster County and also in Holmes County. Now, again, this wasn't the only stop in Pennsylvania, particularly in Lancaster County. I mentioned there was a stop at the Lancaster Airport. Here's a photo from one of those gatherings at the Lancaster Airport, which I think is a really interesting juxtaposition here. So you have two young boys holding a sign that says Veterans for Bush and members of the Amish community cheering. So obviously the members of the Amish community are not holding the sign, but the fact that they're in close proximity I think is rather interesting. I was there for that event. I was able to observe it. It was a very interesting and exciting day because Air Force One landed at the Lancaster Airport, Lititz Airport. And if you've not been there before, it's not a large airport. So I think a lot of folks were skeptical that a plane that size could land there. And sure enough, they made it work. And it was very, very exciting to see. And so that got everyone's enthusiasm very high, as you might imagine. But then after the 2004 election, there really wasn't much of a formal outreach effort to the Amish community for subsequent presidential elections in 2008 and 2012. But then something different happened in 2016, something that we hadn't seen before. Still, Pennsylvania was viewed as a swing state. It was a state that would have been very helpful either to the Trump campaign or the Hillary Clinton campaign. Hadn't voted Republican since 1988, but still, despite that, it was viewed as a state that could be in play. And a political action committee was formed specifically to reach out to Amish voters. Now, this political action committee had its headquarters in Northern Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C., but they were aided by a former member of the Amish community here in Lancaster County with outreach efforts. And they engaged in a number of mailings, a number of advertisements, some town hall style meetings at fire departments in eastern Lancaster County. And to provide just a little bit more background, the way that this connection all came about was one of the gentlemen who was in charge of this political action committee had close connections to Newt Gingrich. You might remember he's the former Speaker of the House, also former presidential candidate, and he himself had some Pennsylvania connections, spending some time in Hummelstown growing up. And during this time, these individuals, before forming Amish Pact, had done significant work for Ben Carson. You might remember he was former HUD secretary in the Trump administration. He himself was a presidential candidate, and he had authored the book Gifted Hands. And it turns out that a number of Amish individuals had read that book. And so some of those individuals who read the book and also were sympathetic to Mr. Carson's campaign got engaged with a separate political action committee, which provided at least one linkage to Amish throughout the country as a result of that connection. And then they began to connect the dots. Well, maybe there's an opportunity here to mobilize Amish voters. And that's why Amish Pact was started. I'm glossing over this in the interest of time, but that gives you a very quick overview as to how and why Amish Pact came to be. Now, I think that a number of observers didn't know what to make of Amish Pact because would it be effective? Certainly, we had very different candidates in 2016 than what we did in 2004. It was a happy time. It was one of the most aggressive campaigns that we've seen in quite some time. Both candidates had just abysmal approval ratings. It really didn't matter which side of the political aisle you were on. The poll ratings were down for both candidates. It got very ugly, very aggressive, and obviously there was concerns about ethical behavior and the morality of both candidates. And so, how would this play out with members of the Amish community? It was an open question. But there were some interesting ways of trying to bridge this divide that we've never seen before in terms of outreach to members of the Amish community. And this is one of the billboards that was sponsored by Amish Pact. And it appeared along Route 30 here in Lancaster County, and there were other billboards throughout Lancaster County as well. But this is a pretty typical example. And what you can see here, the sign says, "Vote Trump, registered by October 11th." And it might be a little hard to see, but in the bottom portion here it says, "Hardworking, pro-life, family dedicated, just like you." And then there's a picture of a horse and buggy with, maybe you can see this here, there's the orange triangle, and right above that is an I voted sticker. So there was a number of variations on this billboard about remembering when to register, remember when election day was, things of that nature. But it wasn't limited to just billboard advertisements. Here's an advertisement that was placed in the budget. This appeared July 13th, 2016. And it has a picture of Donald Trump here. It says, "Did you know? The 2016 presidential election will be on Tuesday, November 8th, 2016. And there's a number of checklist items here underneath that you might not be able to see very clearly. I'll read them out here. Trump has never been a politician or held elected office. Trump is considered one of the most accomplished businessmen in the world. Trump's business is truly family run. He has tasked his adult children with running his business while he runs for president. Trump is known for his strong work ethic. Trump will appoint pro-life Supreme Court justices who protect religious liberty and individual freedom. Trump abstains from alcohol. He has said, quote, 'I never had a drink. I never had a glass of alcohol.' He says he's seen what happens when people, quote, 'lose control.'" Without getting into a lot of details on this, this advertisement created some controversy in the budget. The budget received letters, phone calls, asking why this was placed. Amish PAC actually had plans to run several other advertisements after this particular one. But there was real concern, and it's a topic for another time, but I think that the responses from some members of the Amish community after seeing this advertisement also emphasized a sense of collective ownership, if you will, of the budget, feeling like it was part of who they were in their community, and they wanted to make sure that something like this didn't happen again. It was an anomaly, to say the least, I think, relative to other advertisements that would appear in it, and as a result, the budget did not run the subsequent advertisements. They were refunded back to Amish PAC, and the executives at Amish PAC fully understood, and they didn't press the issue. But this wasn't the only advertisement. Here's an example of one that was in the Advertiser, a penny saver type of publication, and it was also in Lancaster Farming. And as many of you are aware, Lancaster Farming is a periodical that many Amish individuals, and particularly those who are in the agricultural community, read with some regularity. And it's a similar type of advertisement. Here, the photograph, though, features both President Trump and soon-to-be Vice President Mike Pence. Reminders on registration, deadlines. It says, "Voting in Pennsylvania is easy. To vote, you must be a citizen of the United States, be a resident of Pennsylvania, and be at least 18 years of age on the day of the election." Now, at the bottom here, there's a fascinating note. It says, "Note, bring ID to your polling place on election day. Photo and non-photo IDs are acceptable," so underscoring that. Accepted non-photo IDs include a utility bill, firearm permit, current pay stub, current bank statement, or voter ID card issued by the voter registration office. So again, realizing that photo ID may be an issue for some members of the Plain community, and noting that here are some other opportunities to present that identification. In Pennsylvania, right now, the current law is you only need to show that identification the first time that you vote at a polling location, but not in subsequent polling locations. So they were assuming that many of these members of the Amish community would be first-time voters, and they would have to meet that legal requirement in order to cast a ballot. And there were subsequent outreach efforts. In the 2018 midterm elections, we saw a variation of the billboard from 2016. Instead of endorsing a particular candidate, it just says, "Don't forget to vote." That's it. And it has, again, the picture of the Amish buggy with the I voted sticker on the back, and a reminder of the registration deadline. And then in 2020, we saw more systematic outreach, not only by Amish PAC, but by other political operative groups. In the photo on the right here, it's kind of hard to make out exactly, but this is Route 8, which spans basically from Pittsburgh up towards Erie in the western part of Pennsylvania. So this would have been in the western part of the Commonwealth. And it appears to be a buggy flying a Trump flag, Trump 2020, and here's another photo from a different angle. And I say Amish in Western Pennsylvania, ? Because it's not exactly clear if the individual photographed in this buggy is a member of the Amish community. It might be a little difficult to see, but it appears that they're wearing blue jeans and sneakers and a rather casual shirt and a hat. Also, the Trump 2020 flag says, "No more bull." I'll let you fill in the blank there. Then we have, in Fredericksburg, Ohio, a photo here on the right. This was a parade which allegedly featured several members of the Amish community in horse and buggies, flying flags. This was organized in part by Bikers for Trump, a gentleman by the name of Christopher Cox, who would later run for Congress in South Carolina, helped with outreach efforts in Fredericksburg, Ohio, trying to mobilize the Amish there, in addition to what happened with AmishPac. Just to give you a sense of how much money was spent, this is all based upon Federal Election Commission filings. Starting in 2015-2016 election cycle, so this would have been the presidential election in 2016, AmishPac spent some $139,000 on advertisements and other outreach efforts. Again, mainly towards the Plain community, although certainly these billboards would have been seen by other individuals. The advertisements, particularly in Lancaster farming, would have been seen by English individuals too, so it wouldn't have exclusively have been just Amish individuals seeing these outreach efforts. It would have been others as well. In the midterm elections, a little over $80,000 spent, but then for the 2020 election, we see a significant uptick. So just over $200,000 was spent by AmishPac alone. And these donations came from all over the country, multiple states, dozens of states all throughout the country as well. So it wasn't localized to any particular state, and these donations were not necessarily coming from individuals in Amish communities either. And I think something else that made 2020's outreach efforts and the lead up to 2020 a little different is Congressman Lloyd Smucker, too. As many of you may know, Congressman Smucker represents now the 11th Congressional District, which encompasses Lancaster County, and he, too, was born Amish. Actually, he's distant cousins with Chet Byler, interestingly enough. And this is a photograph that appeared in the LNP paper, our local newspaper here in Lancaster County, where Congressman Smucker showed members of the Lancaster Amish community the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. This is, I believe, actually a photograph that was taken on the Speaker's balcony at the Capitol building overlooking the mall, and you can see the Washington Monument there in the distance. And this photograph took place in September of 2018. This is a Facebook post from Congressman Smucker. This is one of his official accounts. It's dated December 26, 2019. I'll read this aloud to you. I was thrilled to have two Amish men from the 11th Congressional District at this historic meeting with President Donald J. Trump and Vice President Mike Pence. Being born Amish, I know how important it is that we address the critical issues facing these communities. And this links to a newspaper story from the Washington Times online. So there was an opportunity. It was publicized to some extent, but there weren't any photographs or anything of the sort of some members of the Amish community meeting with the president in Washington, D.C., having discussions of faith. And I do know that there were efforts by the local Republican Party here in Lancaster County. There were also letters that were sent out by Congressman Smucker, specifically to members of the Amish community asking for their vote in 2020. So that provides a brief overview of some of the outreach that we've seen in recent presidential elections. So let's talk about the data analysis here and what we were able to do. This was a very time-consuming task because what we're doing is downloading the voter registration rolls from multiple jurisdictions and then cross-referencing them with the Amish church directories to try to identify those members of the Amish community who are registered voters and who actually turned out to vote. Now, this is still a work in progress. We have not conducted any qualitative interviews yet with regard to the 2020 election. We're just wrapping up the 2020 data now. But we have data from Wisconsin, Michigan, and Indiana for 2016 and 2020. We have data from Holmes County, Ohio, 2004 and 2016. We're going to finish up 2020 here this summer. And we have Pennsylvania data, at least for Lancaster County, for 2004, 2016, and 2020. And each state is a little different in terms of how they provide members of the public voter information. Sometimes they provide whether the individual turned out to vote. Sometimes they only tell you if they were registered to vote. Sometimes party affiliation is not provided. So we do have some variability that way in the data. So let's start with Wisconsin. And the counties that we focused on in Wisconsin were Columbia, Green Lake, Taylor, and Vernon counties. So by our estimates, there would have been about 2,900 Amish of voting age, so 18 years of age or older in 2016, and about 31, almost 3,200 by 2020. There were 6 registered Amish in 2016 and 4 in 2020. So either they moved out of Wisconsin or these settlements, or they were inactive. But as you can see, Amish turnout was 100%. I had to throw that in there, sorry. It's a very small number. So that's the extent of Wisconsin that I'll present, because it's very small numbers. In Michigan, we do see some small numbers here. So about 2,400 individuals would have been of voting age in 2016, a little more in 2020, about 2,600. And this would have been Branch, Hillsdale, St. Joseph, and Osceola counties. Those were the counties that we selected. About 6% of Amish voters would have registered. Okay, we don't have turnout information for Michigan, unfortunately. So we're a little bit at a disadvantage to see how many of those actually decided to go to the polls. But we can at least say that of the eligible Amish adults, it appears about 6% registered to vote. Again, it's probably unlikely that all of these individuals turned out to vote, but at least that gives you a ceiling for possibilities. And whenever you look at the percentage breakdown by gender, overwhelmingly it's male. Amish voters in Michigan, and this is true in other settlements as well, they tend to be male voters. More than 60% in 2016, and basically 3/4 of Amish voters in 2020 in Michigan were men. Turning to Indiana, Elkhart, I always have problems saying it. Is it Kosciuszko? Kosciuszko. I'm Polish, so I should be able to say these kinds of things, but I apologize. Marshall and St. Joseph counties. So 2016, about 2,900, almost 3,000 Amish individuals who could be registered voters, but only 83 were registered. And this is the Napanee settlement, the Napanee directory. I should clarify that here. And that decreased to 61 in 2020. So again, very small. If we break this down by gender, again, overwhelmingly male, almost 70% in 2016, and also 70% in 2020 in terms of what percentage of the voters were men versus women. And we don't have the party registration for these years just because of the way party ID works in some of these areas, particularly in Ohio. Normally, whenever you show up for a primary, that's how you determine your party identification. So if you never vote in a primary, you won't necessarily be affiliated with a political party there. We're still in the process now of coding for 2020 in Holmes County, but you can at least see the comparison for what Don and I were able to do in 2004, and also our estimates now for 2016 that Steve Knowlton and I had worked on. So we have seen an increase in the overall Amish population, but not quite as proportionate of an increase in the registered voters. There has been an increase between 2004 and 2016 from 3,297 to 3,596, but overall, as a percentage of the population, it's decreased, going from 42% to about 35%. and turnout is lower. So of the registered voters, about 29% turned out to vote in 2004. It's about 23% of the registered voters turned out to vote in 2016. So there are several hundred Amish registered to vote and turning out to vote in the Holmes County settlement, at least based on the most recent data that we have for 2016. We do have some limited data that I wanted to share here. This isn't perfect, but I think it comports what I'm going to show a little bit later with Lancaster County, overwhelmingly Republican registered voters in Holmes County. Very few are Democrats, and then no one's registered really as a third party. And again, based upon gender, overwhelmingly male. More than 3/4 were men in 2004, and gap narrowed slightly in 2016. So it's about 69% of registered Amish voters were men in 2016. All right, now we'll get to Pennsylvania. And I think Pennsylvania is an interesting case study for a number of reasons, because of the number of Amish that are living here, given the emphasis on outreach efforts that were specifically focused on Pennsylvania. But you can see here, this is the New Wilmington settlement out in the western part of Pennsylvania. So we're looking at Lawrence and Mercer counties. So a little over 1,000 or so Amish who could have registered to vote in 2016, that is 18 years of age or older, and should be about 1,300 or so individuals by 2020. What I find so fascinating here is the percentage of registered Amish out of the voting age population. This strikes me as a very high percentage. So of the Amish in 2016 who were of voting age, 65% of them were registered to vote. Now, only 16% then actually turned out and voted, but still, even in 2020, more than half were registered to vote of those individuals who are 18 years of age. I won't get into all the details on this, but there's a really fascinating backstory to this. Before the pandemic started, Steve and I had the chance to travel to Duquesne University and meet with a gentleman by the name of Frank Chiazza, who is a retired judge, Court of Common Pleas judge, and he was a federal magistrate in the Western District of Pennsylvania. And he teaches occasionally at Duquesne and Pitt, if memory serves me. And it appears that his work as an attorney influenced political activity in the New Wilmington settlement. He argued free of charge on behalf of the Amish community a United States Supreme Court case called United States versus Lee in 1981. The dispute was over whether or not Amish employers, not employees, employers were required to pay Social Security taxes. And Social Security Administration, IRS, they were in the process of essentially prosecuting Mr. Lee for this, and members of the community viewed this as a First Amendment free exercise issue. And through a number of back channels, Mr. Chiazza had learned about this and offered his services to the Amish community for free, ultimately arguing it to the United States Supreme Court. He lost that case, but it was the impetus for Congress to later revise the statute to provide that flexibility for members of the Amish community. And what was so fascinating was, in this conversation, Mr. Chiazza also credited his wife with helping to meet with members of the Amish community and emphasizing that, well, if you're not willing to engage, something like this could happen to you in the future. And interestingly enough, Mr. Chiazza was also running for judge at the exact same time. If memory serves me, he actually missed Election Day because that was the day of the oral arguments in the United States Supreme Court. He won. He won that election as a Democrat. Very interesting for that part of the state. And to see such a high turnout and local political operatives in the western part of the state really do credit Mr. Chiazza's victory in large part to the New Wilmington settlement. So in short, it appears that something very interesting is going on out that way. And when we look at the voter registration numbers, in terms of gender, they're much closer to gender parity. Much closer to gender parity. There is still a gap, but it's within the 50s. The other settlements that we've seen thus far tended to be in the 60s or 70% range in terms of male registered voters, but there's a significant portion of the voters in the New Wilmington settlement who are women. Sorry here, I went the wrong way. And consistent with other findings, particularly for Holmes County, again, overwhelmingly Republican, so 97, 98%. And then the next closest category would be other, a third party or an independent or no registration stated at all. Finally, we get to Lancaster County, and this is the county where we have data for all three presidential elections for 2004, 2016, and 2020. I'll start off with 2004. Again, this is the Bush-Cheney re-election bid in 2004. So there's somewhere around 10,000 Amish who could have voted if they registered as of the 2004 election in Lancaster County. This doesn't include neighboring counties. This is Lancaster settlement, but just Lancaster County itself. So at that time, a little over 2,000 actually registered to vote, but fewer turned out. We saw only about 60-some% actually turned out to vote in the 2004 election. And there's a long backstory to this, and Don and I laid out in our 2007 article where there was some pushback by Amish bishops in particular. There were letters to the editor in places like the Budget and the Diary and other periodicals emphasizing that this creates a slippery slope. So even though a large number of Amish registered to vote in the lead up to the presidential election, many of them ultimately stayed home on election day. Then in 2016, we see this growth in terms of the Amish population. So we go from about 10,000 who could have voted in 2004 to about 15,000 that could have voted in 2016. But if you look at the percentages, they've actually dropped. Now, one of the flaws here is we don't have data for the previous election. So we can't really say, you know, did registration rates plummet after the 2004 election and now they're on their way up? It's kind of hard to assess this in a vacuum, but we can say that they clearly were not as high of voter registration rates and turnout rates relative to 2004. In fact, just about 1,000 Amish voters turned out in Lancaster County in the 2016 presidential election. So why is that? Is it because of the candidates? Is it because outreach efforts had failed? Is it the fact that there was a steep drop-off after 2004 and they're slowly working their way up? It's very difficult to say. But then that leads us to 2020. And I'll be honest, I was very surprised by these data. About 16,000, almost 17,000 individuals could have been of registered voters in 2020. Around 4,100 registered voters. So it essentially doubled. The number of registered voters who are Amish in Lancaster County doubled between 2016 and 2020. And we had about a 71% turnout of those registered voters. Just to put this in perspective, the statewide turnout for registered voters was about 75% in the 2020 election. So it's awfully close, 71.27%. Again, that dwarfs the turnout from the 2004 and 2016 presidential elections. So something's going on. And again, we see that overwhelmingly these registered voters are Republican. Obviously, we can't tell how they voted, but we can make inferences based upon their voter registration status. And you can see still in Lancaster settlement, it tends to be male. But over time, that gap is closing just a bit. So it went from the 70s in 2004, 2016 to about 68% male in the 2020 presidential election. And what I'd like to do now is show you a few maps so you can see where registration and turnout was most pronounced in Lancaster County. So what we have here is a map of the county, and you can see the eastern part is where the shades are the darkest, meaning greater turnout. So the largest registrations occurred in Salisbury Township, 747 registered Amish there, Laycock Township, 646, followed by Paradise Township, 396, Upper Laycock, 320, and Strasburg Township, 279. And if we look at turnout, this is registration. The next slide looks almost identical. These are Amish who actually turned out to vote. Again, it's going to be in these townships, these municipalities that already had large registration numbers, and it's in pretty much the same exact order. Salisbury Township, 569 turned out to vote. Laycock Township, 485 turned out to vote. Paradise, 291. Upper Laycock, 229. And Strasburg Township, 172. Another way of looking at this is what percentage of registered Amish turned out to vote. Now, in municipalities that have small registration numbers, remember back to Wisconsin, 100% turnout, while there's 4 and 6 registered voters there. So we have to take that with a little bit of a grain of salt. But you can see here, again, it's predominantly in the central and northern parts of the counties where you have the highest turnout rates. And then generally speaking, in the southern end, you see some lower turnout rates. And that comports with what we would expect in terms of the conservative nature of the settlement within Lancaster County. Just generally speaking, you tend to have more conservative members in the southern end, closer you get to Route 30 in the north, greater interaction with members of the English community, maybe a little more progressive, relatively speaking, at least compared with the southern end. So I thought I would close by offering some thoughts for the future. And I think that one thing that we've heard repeatedly throughout this conference is that the Amish are not monolithic. There's great variation. I think the data bear that out here. What's happening in one state and one settlement isn't necessarily true of another. But what we're also seeing is greater intentionality by political operatives to mobilize members of the Amish community. And at least within the Lancaster settlement and the New Wilmington settlement, there appears to be data to support the conclusion that it may be having an effect. And I think that raises a number of important questions about what this means for Old Order communities in terms of assimilation. What does it mean for greater engagement? What does this mean for two-kingdom theology? Is it the fact that the Amish are moving away from their values? Are they reinterpreting what the two-kingdom theology means? How do they view political participation now? We haven't had the opportunity to do any sort of interviews or in-depth conversations on this topic, and I'm not taking a normative stance on this one way or another, but I think that there are some important questions that these data raise in terms of what this means for the Amish community going forward, and it'll be a fascinating conversation for sure. And with that, too, I'd welcome questions, comments, and like I said, too, even if you don't have a question but you wanted to share an anecdote or something that you've observed about the Amish community in your part of the country and any sort of political outreach efforts, that would be most welcome. But thank you all so very much for your time and attention. I appreciate it.
Hi, thank you very much. Fascinating. A couple of questions. The first is, I'm curious if the Democrat Party, advertised at all in the community.
Not recently. That's a great question. So the question was about Democratic advertisements and outreach. There was an effort by one of the local Democratic committees in Ohio to do kind of like a counter advertisement to what was in the budget. But that was about the extent of it. There hasn't been, to my knowledge at least, any formal outreach by members of the Democratic Committee to members of the Amish community or other advertisements, say in Lancaster Farming, that tailored the message towards them.
I don't know if this question is too granular, but I was wondering how the Plain communities juxtapose, and again, it's not monolithic, but how those who support Trump, how they balance the position that he had taken about new immigrants and refugees and welcoming the stranger?
You know, that's a really great question. So how did the Plain community react to Donald Trump? I don't know. It's a really complicated question because a lot, I think, also depends on how much background was acknowledged within the Amish community about, you know, his personal family life and background and controversies there. But at the same time, there was a very intentional outreach effort emphasizing free exercise of religion, pro-life policies. A lot of social conservative issues were emphasized. And also, I think that the fact that this wasn't necessarily a top-down effort, at least in Lancaster County. Yes, we did have activity by Amish PAC, and that was a little bit more of a top-down effort. But you still had trusted members of the community on the ground, like Congressman Smucker, reaching out to the Amish community. And I think that grassroots mobilization, you know, again, all politics is local, I think that matters. And even though we don't have strong data to suggest this yet, because we haven't conducted it, we haven't done the interviews, but my hunch is that that's probably what played out in 2020, because we saw a similar pattern in the 2004 election with Chet Byler. So I think that's probably the key. If you have that strong connection with a trustworthy party, that's probably the way to make inroads.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Doctor, good morning. I believe you've written about a selection of vice presidential candidates, the importance or lack thereof. And this could just a supposition or a surmise. What do you think the influence of having Mike Pence, who had come to the county, I believe, both in 16 and 20 more than once, as an identifiable conservative Christian, how do you think that affected Plain enrollment and Plain voting?
Thank you for that question. So this is my other line of research about selecting vice presidents. So how did Mike Pence play into this? Without getting into the book too much, our main finding there was the selection of a vice president influences how people think about the presidential candidate. And so someone like Mike Pence, who was an open evangelical Christian, someone who was much more like George W. Bush than Donald Trump. And honestly, Vice President Pence was sent to a number of conservative communities and counties, not just in Pennsylvania, but all throughout the country in 2016 and 2020 to try and reinforce that message. At the end of the day, you know, voters are voting for the presidential candidate, but the vice presidential candidate can influence how they perceive the presidential candidate. And I think there's a very good argument to be made that someone like Mike Pence, who can have those open and honest conversations about religion and the importance of God and faith and conservative social values, at the very least, I can say this, it didn't hurt. Yeah. Could it have helped? It's entirely possible, but I don't think it hurt.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I have a comment and a question. The comment is, first of all, thank you for your breakdown on gender. I happened to be in Intercourse, Pennsylvania during the 2016 election, there for a couple hours in the morning, and what I noticed was younger couples going in to vote on their way to an Amish wedding, both the husband and the wife. And I thought that'll be an interesting phenomenon to watch to see if that's a trend. My question is just if you could say a little bit more about your methodology. How did you identify, because when we vote, we don't tell our religion. How did you identify the folks who were Amish?
Sure. And to your comment, I haven't gotten into this in the data quite yet, but just by doing a very rough overview of observations, what we saw in 2020, I think relative to previous years, is more household voting. So more husband and wife votes, and if there are children in the household who are of voting age, I think families tend to vote together. Or there's going to be individuals who have the same surname living right next door to each other. We also saw that type of phenomenon too. So I think there's a strong argument to be made about social networks and the influence that they have in driving out vote choice. obviously we'll have to dig into the data, but that's just a very rough impression that I have. So for these analyses, and again, I really need to thank our research team for helping to do a lot of the heavy lifting on this. We're able to take the voter registration rolls, sort them, and then cross-reference with all the church directories. So it's a very tedious process. And I know a lot of other folks are doing similar types of analyses, but it takes a great deal of time. And here it is 2 years after the 2020 election, and we still haven't been able to fully code all the settlements that we wanted to, just because it takes a lot of time and effort. But we're getting there.
You briefly addressed the gap from 2004 to 2016, but I'm curious, what's the rationale or the reason that you don't have any data from 2008 and 2012?
We couldn't get it. So I was ideally, I'd love to be able to do this, but I don't think we're able to. I was in grad school in 2008, and then 2020 or 2012, it just didn't really occur to us to do an updated analysis. And the way that the voter registration rolls work, they're periodically updated as folks move, as they receive death certificates, things like that. So even though we have a voter registration roll, for these data, we got them right after each election. So we're able to see who actually turned out and voted. But let's say that someone voted several years ago and then they pass away, they would have been removed from the voter registration roll. So we have all this censoring of data. And we're just not able to analyze it for those past years because the data change over time. If I had to guess, and this is pure speculation, but if I had to guess, there probably wasn't as much of a turnout phenomenon in 2008 or in 2012, simply because there wasn't any systematic outreach efforts, at least to our knowledge. It seemed after 2004, things went dark for a little while. And it really wasn't until 2016 that we started to see something systematic happening. And I think that was the key, at least in 2004. And there's some anecdotal information about the 1960 presidential election, too. Everyone can put on their thinking caps. Anyone remember the candidates from 1960? Nixon Kennedy, right? And what religion was Nixon?
He was Quaker.
Yeah, Quaker, right? Society of Friends. So there was some information that suggested that that type of personality, that Peace Church affiliation, helped to bolster plain group participation in the election for Nixon, and also anti-Catholic sentiment too. But that's anecdotal for the most part. So that's the best other data point that I can compare with.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Quick question over here. Recent discussion with a member, he commented that he had two prayers since 1973. One was for his children, the other was to overturn Roe. And he said one of the goals he had was that he prayed that Trump would end abortion. And he feels that was a victory. And I'm wondering how that may influence the next election where they actually saw a consequence of their prayers, let's say, or their interest in ending abortion.
That's a great question. Yeah, certainly we have a lot of information suggesting that support of pro-life policies was at the forefront for outreach for a lot of these elections. It wasn't the only thing that was discussed by any means, but it was a frequently used talking point when operatives would reach out to members of the plain community. So now that we may be on the verge of a Supreme Court decision shortly that overturns Roe versus Wade, what does this mean for plain group participation, where if that was one of the motivating factors that led them to be politically involved, and it does occur, does that reinforce the idea that they should be politically involved? Or do they feel like, well, okay, we got a good positive result that we hoped for, and maybe now we don't need to be involved. I think that's an open question. Another reason why this research project will be ongoing for many, many years to come, I'm sure.
Great presentation, Kyle. Thank you so much. And one comment following up on the 1960 election. Sorry, some years ago I was chatting with an older Amish man during the Bush years, the George W. Bush years, about voting. And I said, did you ever vote? He grew up in Michigan. And he said, yeah, one time. It's in 1960. And I said, oh, why? And he said, because my neighbors were saying we got to vote against Kennedy. And I said, well, was there something about, like, Nixon and the Quaker stuff? And he said, I don't think he was still Quaker, right? And I think there may be something true to that, but the Quaker part didn't fit into it. But it was his non-Amish neighbors who were saying that the Amish should go out and join them in voting against a Catholic. And I said, so how'd you feel about that? He said, it was the worst decision I made as far as, like, interacting, with the politics stuff. He said, because I thought Kennedy was a really good president. And he was very sad, actually, when Kennedy died. And he said, and that's the last time he ever voted, right? He said,
I'm really glad that you brought that up. There were some anecdotes that we collected in the 2007 article that Don and I wrote, particularly in light of President Kennedy's assassination, because if so many Amish had turned out and voted against him, or for Nixon, depending on your point of view, that suggested something about God's will and whether or not the community had done something against God's will by supporting a different candidate. There's a phrase that we had uncovered in our qualitative work before: God never lost an election. So what does that mean? I think that's a really fascinating viewpoint. Thanks.
Kyle, I can't resist from telling this personal story that underscores what Mark was saying, but my father was a Mennonite farmer in Lancaster County, dairy farmer, and in the 60 election, Kennedy and Nixon, he came home from voting that day, and he apologized to me. He said, Donald, I've never voted before in my life, and I think this may be the last time, but I just had to do it because I'm just so afraid the Pope's going to take over the world and control everything. So I think the Quaker thing with Nixon wasn't at all attractive to my dad, but it was a negative thing against Catholics taking. I mean, it was amazing that he apologized for it. I don't think he ever voted again.
That's interesting. I'm curious now, something that we'll have to bring up in our qualitative interviews. Obviously, Joe Biden's Catholic, but I don't know if it was nearly as salient of an issue as 1960 for a variety of reasons. So was that even a factor in recent elections? Open question.
I was intrigued about Lawrence County, Mercer County, because that's one very conservative settlement. Did you have any tip-off that would be a high area?
I think that we had some conversations. Actually, Steve had some conversations which kind of raised or piqued our interest on this out in the western part of the state, just asking around about whether any settlements, because we knew about Lancaster. We knew that there had been a history of voting in Lancaster, and so one of the questions is, well, how common is this in other settlements? We also looked at Center County, for example. Didn't present it here, but low rates. But if I remember right, and Steve, if I'm mischaracterizing anything, that you had a meeting with a county official out in the western part of the state, and they said, well, yeah, this has been happening in the New Wilmington area, so that led us to look into the data, and sure enough, we found something.
There would be other population areas that would be higher population than Lawrence and Mercer, like Jefferson County and Punxsutawney area, as well as Crawford County and Juniata and Mifflin. Was there any reason why you didn't choose those?
Just time and effort. That's the main reason why. We tried to just put together a good sample, but if there are other, and please do let us know, if there are other settlements or locales that we ought to be looking into. We do have the statewide data, the voter registration rolls. It's just a matter of then comparing against the church directories and cross-referencing them. So that's why. But please let us know if you think that there are other places we ought to be looking.
Just a note on that Catholic question. My parents married in 1958, and so many stories of grandparents and people in that day voting once in their lifetime. That was just a very common thing that I heard while growing up, and the fear of the Catholics. And the quote often was, there was no reason, nothing happened with the Catholic nominee, and that fear went away completely.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thanks for that.
Thank you, Kyle. This is really fascinating. I know you haven't collected data on this, but I'm curious, particularly with that Mercer County, the Western PA example, it was very clear that there was a local candidate that got people maybe to the polls. Do you have a sense of maybe midterm elections or local candidates, maybe someone like Smucker, if that's also a big, so outside of the presidential candidate piece?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So what motivates people? I think it's obviously going to vary from settlement to settlement. And at least whenever we've seen some sort of spike in turnout, there has been an individual, not necessarily the presidential candidate. That can influence it. I think, having, qualities and characteristics that resonate with the voters. But it's really that grassroots movement. So having someone that has strong connections, and I glossed over this a little bit with the Lancaster settlement, but I mean, there were even state representatives in eastern Lancaster County that were working on this, in addition to Congressman Smucker. So there were folks who knew Amish neighbors, who had a good working relationship with them and intentionally reached out to them. I remember that there were some very early discussions in the 2004 election about bringing in busloads of volunteers from other states that were not competitive, like New York and New Jersey and Delaware, with the idea of going door to door in Amish communities. And some folks here in Lancaster County said, no, that's not a good idea. That's going to be very counterproductive because no one has that strong individual relationship with them already. Well, everyone, thank you so much. It's been a delight, and thank you to the Young Center for this wonderful, wonderful conference. Safe travels to everyone.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kopko. And again, thanks to all of you for being here and for making our conference so interesting and educational for me and for everyone who's been attending and participating.